So this is chapter 10, public and private land. So we'll be talking about basically how land is used in the United States. Sounds kind of boring, but there are actually some pretty fascinating parts. So our learning targets, explain how human land use affects the environment and describe the various categories of public land use in the U.S. So the first thing that I want to talk about, you guys know already, and this is written down for you, is changes to the landscape or changes in habitat is the single biggest cause of species extinction. Remember, we talked about habitat loss being number one, okay? And we've seen graphs like this, right? The human population, as the human population increases, the numbers of extinctions increase. And we've been talking about how this is really evidence for what scientists are now calling the sixth mass extinction, which they believe is a mass extinction caused by humans. And really, that's why it's different from the other mass extinctions we've had in the past, is because this one is human caused. So if we think about it, how do the following change landscapes? Okay, logging. How would logging change a landscape? How would paving change a landscape? How would farming change a landscape? If you're thinking about logging is cutting down trees, right? So why would it matter if we cut down trees? Well, you don't need to write this down, but I just wanted to get you thinking, right? So like logging, how would that change? Well, if we cut down trees, we would lose habitat, so loss of habitat, okay? It would impact water cycle, because remember the water cycle, we have evaporation happening from those trees and from those plants, okay? We might get some soil erosion. Why? Because those trees are holding, the roots are holding that soil in place. Pavement. Again, we're going to get an impact on the water cycle, right? Because no longer are we going to be able to have that water just filter in to the ground because the pavement's covering it. We're also probably going to compact the soil. And we know that when it's compacted, there's less room for roots. It can cause more runoff. It can increase flooding. Why? Because the water is going to pick up speed as it goes down that paved area, and it's not going to be able to seep into the ground. Farming. How does farming change landscapes? Well, it depletes the soil of nutrients. It might contribute to runoff, increase soil erosion, compact the land, the soil. So lots of different things. And what I want you to start thinking about is how, as humans, do we change our land? Because we're talking about land right now. So the tragedy of the commons, this is review, you have it written down. The tendency of a shared limited resource to become depleted. Why? Because people act out of their own interest, their own self-interest. They're not worried about what's good for everybody else. They're worried about themselves. So we talked about the fishing. Remember the fishing lab we did, okay? Where you had to take goldfish, and you needed to get enough goldfish in order to survive. Well, you wanted to take enough. You wanted to take a lot because then you would make more money, you would survive longer. But if you took as many as you wanted and everybody else did too, over time, we are going to end up with less and less fish, okay? The classic example here is if we have an area of land that's used for grazing, okay? And basically, it's a free area. Your animals can come graze on it. If our animals, if all the farmers decide to put as many animals as they can on this land and don't put a limit, over time, this land is going to become overgrazed, right? And so there's less plants, there's going to be more erosion, and eventually there's not going to be any grass left. So how do we prevent this? Okay, we prevent it by putting limits or regulations, and also by privatizing land. You'll notice the word private in there. So making land private instead of public. And we'll talk about the different ways that you can do this. But the government has set aside pieces of land through parks and wilderness areas where they're able to own that land so that it doesn't become degraded. So the maximum sustainable yield, we've talked about this a little bit, again, with our goldfish. This is the maximum amount that can be harvested sustainably, which means we make sure that there's enough to continue on in the future. And this is going to change, right? Some years the maximum sustainable yield might be higher because there's enough water, okay, like for deer, okay? Maybe there's not that much disease, there's enough food and water. The maximum sustainable yield is really high. Then another year there's a drought and a lot of disease, so the maximum sustainable yield is going to be a lot lower. So it depends on the environment and it depends on the population. So whenever we talk about the tragedy of the commons, it's an example of an externality. So external means outside, right? And an externality is a cost or benefit, and it's not included in the price of that good or service. So it's a cost or benefit, and it's not necessarily seen by that person. It's to a third party, okay? So go ahead and write that down. So in the tragedy of the commons, the externality then, right, it says down here, the cost of the degradation of land. So the land is being degraded, and maybe that doesn't affect you right away, but it affects everybody else who's using that land as well. So another example, there's externalities everywhere. Okay, construction workers disrupting your sleep. It's not included in the price of constructing a building. Okay, the construction workers aren't paying for it, the building people aren't paying for it, but it's an extra thing that isn't really considered that is affecting a third party, affecting other people, you. Okay, now this can be positive or negative. Let me show you some examples. Okay, so positive externalities. Hand washing. Okay, you don't need to write anything down for these. We're going to go over some other examples in a second that you'll write down. So hand washing, why is this positive? Because if you wash your hands, you decrease the chance you'll get sick, okay? Well, that's normal. The externality is that you also decrease the chance that others will get sick. So again, an externality is something that either benefits or hurts somebody else that you don't usually think of in that scenario. So sure, you think about washing your hands for yourself, but how does it benefit or hurt other people? Beekeeping, okay? It gives you honey, so that's what it gives to you, but the service or the externality is it gives pollination for other people. You don't control where those bees go. Those bees are going to go help pollinate other people's flowers and crops. So by raising bees, other people get benefits from your service. Negative externalities. Okay, driving a car. So you're driving a car. How does it affect other people? Well, it creates exhaust and traffic jams. So by you driving a car, you're creating more exhaust, which is going to negatively impact the air quality. Or producing chemicals that cause water pollution, it negatively affects all the others that are affected by that river, the fish and the fishermen who rely on the fish in that river. So your action impacts other people. So take a second and see if you can come up whether with whether or not these are positive or negative. And then after you come up with their positive or negative, see if you can explain or write down why. So smoking cigarettes, it's a bad thing, right? So this is negative, but why? Why is it negative externality? Because You're smoking cigarettes. How does it impact other people? Well, secondhand smoke, right? Secondhand smoke is going to negatively impact others. Gambling addiction, obviously it's a negative, right? Things that are negative are probably going to have negative externalities. So gambling addiction, well, it hurts you, but how does it hurt other people? Well, it impacts your families, right? Anyone you know who's an alcoholic or has an addiction, it's going to negatively impact the other people in your family around you. Vaccines. Vaccines are an example of positive externality. So by you getting a vaccine, you're helping yourself, but how are you helping other people? Well, you're going to be less likely to spread that disease to other people because you are vaccinated. Buying a smoke alarm, again, that's a positive thing, but why? Well, if you buy a smoke alarm, chances are you're going to be less likely to have a fire that burns down and the entire apartment building because you have a smoke alarm that can alert you if there's a fire. So other people will benefit because the chances of you burning down that entire apartment building is a lot less. New landscaping in your neighbor's yard. This is going to be positive. Why? Because if your neighbor puts in new landscaping, it's going to increase the aesthetic or the view of your own neighborhood. Okay, and it might increase your housing price. If the houses around you look good, people are probably going to pay more to buy your house if you have it for sale. All right, so 11% of the earth is protected in one way or another. Here are all the protected areas. Where do you see a lot of them? Obviously, we've got Brazil here and South America. Okay. We see quite a bit in Europe, in Alaska, okay, you know, some patches here. So we have a lot of protected area, right? 1/10 of the earth, pretty much. So what are the categories then? We got national parks, okay? You've probably been to a national park, all right? We have managed resource protected areas, so protected areas where they manage some kind of resource like fish or timber. Habitat management areas, nature preserves, protected landscapes, national monuments. I don't imagine that you would ever have to know the difference between all of these, but know that these are examples of protected lands. And if you were going to suggest something that you could do to protect an area on an FRQ or something, you might want to know a couple of these just so you could pull them out and write them, but I don't expect you to know the difference between all of them. So 42% of the land is publicly held in the US, which is more than any other nation. So a lot of the US is public land or protected land that has rangelands, national forests, national parks, national wildlife refuges, and in wilderness. So you're going to write this down. These are all of the different categories that we have in the United States. So if we look at this, which parts of the U.S. have the most wilderness areas, right? So the most protected areas. We can see Alaska, and we can see the West. So there's a lot in the West, and there's a lot in Alaska, all right? And you'll notice down here there's different colors, right? Bureau of Indian Affairs, right? So these are protected Indian areas. Land management, reclamation, right? So reclaiming land after it's been destroyed. Department of Defense, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, National Park, Tennessee Valley Authority. Okay, these are all the different agencies that have created different areas, and it's all pretty much through the government. So public lands are managed, the government manages these based on this idea of multiple use. So multiple means more than one, and use to use, okay? Well, what does this mean? They want to make sure that they're using the land for the greatest good, for the greatest number of people, okay? So they want to make sure that these lands have lots of different uses and can be used by lots of people. They don't want to make a land that's just protected so that only, you know, I have no idea, only photographers can come use it. Okay, they want the most people to come and use it as possible, but they have to make sure it's sustainable. So in a lot of these places, you will see that fishing is okay, or hunting might be okay, skiing or hiking. Okay, sometimes even like tourism or even mining. So the greatest good for the greatest number of people, we want to make sure that lots of people can use it. So the areas are preserved and managed for economic reasons because they provide money, maybe through tourism, okay, maybe through the goods and services they provide. Scientific, they can do studies. Recreational, that's the biggest one, right? Aesthetic, just for the pure beauty of it. So who manages these areas? Again, you don't need to write this down. A lot of this chapter is not necessarily tested on free response questions. Well, I've seen it on free response questions, but not necessarily heavily tested on the AP exam in general. So yes, you need to know that land is protected. You need to know, multiple use and externalities, but the nitty-gritty of it all, there's a lot of different services and a lot of different organizations that control these areas, okay? And, the details are not necessarily super important. So who manages the areas? Bureau of Land Management, United States Forest Service, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. Again, these are all government run. You can see the National Park Service is the majority of those areas. All right, so we're just going to talk about rangelands pretty quick, and then we will be done. Okay, so not that much left here. So how human land use affects the environment and the categories of public land use in the U.S. is what we're looking at. So rangelands. Rangelands are the most common use of land in the United States. Okay, so first thing I want you to do, write that somewhere. Okay, rangelands are the most common use of land in the U.S., more so than farming, more so than national parks. And what exactly is a rangeland? It's exactly what you see here. Dry, open grasslands used for grazing of whatever kind of animals, okay? So you have this written down, the benefits, okay? Well, if we're grazing, we're using the natural land. And if we're using the natural land, it uses a lot less energy than raising animals in what we call feedlots, or basically big farms. They raise animals a lot of times in basically big sheds, okay, where they have very little room, and the waste is really concentrated. They have to figure out what to do with the manure. It's really smelly. There's lots of disease, so you have to basically use a lot of energy to heat those areas, to provide food and water. So if you're just letting them graze, it's a lot more energy efficient. And in that way, their waste can just get recycled back. The grass grows. You don't have to use energy to produce a whole bunch of feed to feed them because they just eat the grass. Okay. Now, they also provide ecosystem services. Sorry, you guys are going to have to write small. Sorry about that. I didn't leave a lot of space. They provide ecosystem services such as soil formation. Okay, so they help form soil. Why? Because they're recycling this organic matter by basically pooping. Okay. Erosion control. So as long as you're not overgrazing and you still have some of the plants left and roots, they're going to hold that soil in place. Nutrient cycling. So again, that waste is going to be cycled. Provides food. Okay. Provides habitat for other organisms, allows for increased biodiversity. So there's a lot of benefits. the key here is we just got to make sure that they aren't overgrazed or overused. So the problems, too many animals causes overgrazing, right? And when we get overgrazing, then we get erosion. Why? Because those plant roots are not going to hold that soil in place. We get desertification or desertification, either way you want to pronounce it. Basically, the soil turns into a desert, okay, and it can't really hold water because there's not enough plant material in it, and loss of biodiversity. So this is a big problem you'll see in areas where grazing is happening too frequently. So what can people do instead? Well, they can do a couple things. So here are the solutions. Control the number of animals, right? Set a limit, okay? You could also rotate, okay? So here you see a farmer with different pastures, right? So maybe his cows are in pasture 1 for the first week, and then he moves them to pasture 2. And when he moves them here, this grass is allowed to grow again. And then he moves them to pasture 3, and so on, okay? Protect riparian zones. So protect the zones along rivers and streams. The reason that's important is so that we don't get a lot of this animal waste running into rivers and streams, because that's no good. So we want to make sure we protect these river areas from any kind of runoff. So that's where we're going to stop today. We'll be talking about forests when you get back, and enjoy the rest of your day.